Every Sunday morning, we measure our life in love because love is the doctrine of our church. Love is our soul's light. We open every door and every window because our soul's light does not stay inside its house when we are together. The abundant garden of our soul, as Rumi reminds us, comforts us when we are in pain and carries love's message on the east wind. We are not babbling fools because, in Rumi's words, God's grace is with us. In our words, we are not babbling fools because when we gather together, we grow in harmony with the divine. But how do we grow in harmony with the divine as we shelter in place? How do we attend to our pain and suffering and to the pain and suffering of others while we shelter in place? We shelter in grace. We shelter in grace. When I think of the word grace as a Unitarian Universalist, the term means two things for me. First, I define grace as a divinely given blessing felt in the presence of a loving heart. Second, I think of this presence in a loving heart as an inner sunrise. The soul is rising in harmony with the divine. Our heart is no longer sheltering in place, it's sheltered in grace. Every door and every window opens because our soul's light does not stay inside its house when we feel love. The sun of love is now our love, and we as lovers, as Rumi puts it, are now addicted to music and dancing. We sing all day and night like a wailing flute, if only for a moment or two, which is more than enough time for the infinite universe to fill a finite moment of our lives with grace. We have found a way from the grave to paradise because we now behold the joyful heavens in our own body. We feel the inner sunrise in our heart. I felt and watched this inner sunrise happen several years ago when the adult organizers of a youth conference invited me to be the keynote speaker at a youth conference in one of our Midwestern districts of Unitarian Universalism. They wanted me to talk about my book, Learning to be White. I should be hard on the youth, I was told. Make them aware of their white skin privilege. I must make them feel bad about their white privilege, uncover their racist sentiments, and then get them to repent. I knew that almost all of the teens attending the Youth Con retreat would be white. But I'd never met any group of teenagers who collectively didn't feel afflicted by parents and teachers, or who individually hadn't been punished for not being part of the right high school in-group, or who weren't derided for belonging to the wrong one. I had no desire to afflict the afflicted. 50 or so teens were present when I walked out on stage, which had been set up in a high school gym. You probably already know what I'm going to say to you, I began. My statement caught them off guard and they laughed nervously. I then asked for a volunteer who would join me on stage, pretend to be me, and deliver the speech on race, white racism, and white supremacy the teens expected me to deliver. One of the boys immediately raised his hand, took center stage, pretending to be the invited guest speaker, and delivered the speech the teens had expected to hear from me. He explained why prejudice is bad and why racism is wrong and why white supremacy and its institutional systems must be dismantled. There is really only one race, the human race, he concluded, so everybody should cross the racial divides and become one loving racial community. The teens loved the unexpected show in which one of their own had been cast as the star. They applauded him before he began, whistled and shouted throughout his speech, and gave him a standing ovation at the end. The teen bowed several times, raised both arms and made a V victory sign with his fingers, and then started to leave the stage. I asked him to remain on stage and field questions from his audience. He walked to the middle of the stage again, and with body language that said, "Bring it on and show me what you've got," he responded to the queries, again spouting the moral platitudes he had learned from his parents and teachers. One of the teenage girls finally summarized the rising collective discomfort in the gathering, saying, "Tell us something real. Tell us something that will make a difference in our lives right now." The speaker went silent. The time for gaming the system had ended. The teen had just demonstrated to me how to enter the compassionate engagement with them, how to enter into the compassionate engagement with them. I must create a safe space for their hearts to open every door and every window so that their soul's light would not stay inside its shuttered house. I must pay attention to their suffering in their terms rather than mine. I thanked the teen and we applauded him again for his courage and aplomb. I then said to the group, "Let's talk about things that will make a difference in your life right now. Your feelings." I told them stories from my own perfect middle-class life as a teen. I talked about my experiences that made me feel alone and afraid in the midst of my own highly educated, liberal, and professionally successful parental environment. These weren't stories about race. They were stories about loss, about feeling defaced and ignored within my own Pleasantville family. I then left the stage and sat down on the floor in the midst of the group of teens. They immediately formed a large circle in which I was now simply one of the points on the circumference. And then we waited. We waited for their souls to open every window and every door so that their soul's light no longer had to shelter in place. One by one, the teens talked about their feelings. They disclosed stories of feeling like an unwanted child. Stories about not feeling loved, appreciated, or adored enough by the people who were supposed to love and protect them. They told stories about being stigmatized at school because they were the wrong color or weight or gender or class or wore the wrong kinds of clothes or simply because they had a bad hair day. Some of the teens cried as they spoke. They held and comforted one another. At the end of each story, we said together, "We hear you and we hold you in our heart." I then talked about why we were able to be so open and honest with each other. We are Unitarian Universalists, I said, and this is what we do when we come together. We listen to one another, cherish one another, and hold one another in our hearts until we together feel held and heard. At the end of the session, one of the adult chaperones came up to me and held my hand. She told me about how her mother used to hold her hand tightly as a child when they went downtown. Whenever a black person passed by, her mother would squeeze the little girl's hand even tighter. This tightness terrified the child because she could feel her mother's panic. So the child panicked too. She felt like her life was at risk and was afraid that she and her mother would die. Then came her second confession. It has taken her a long time to learn not to panic when she's around black people. She held onto my hand tightly. My hand embraced hers tightly. We didn't speak, but continued to hold hands until her panic and fear subsided. These experiences with the teens and their chaperone reminded me of what an inner sunrise feels like for Unitarian Universalists. Grace. Grace as a divinely given blessing felt in the presence of a loving heart. We know that our youth are a central presence in our lives. And we know that if we give them space, attention, compassion, empathy, and respect, they are not afraid to talk about their feelings of loss and dismay, brokenheartedness and disappointment, panic and fear in personal and collective terms. They are courageous souls. But we sometimes sideline their heartfelt concerns in order to attend to the urgencies and the requirements for keeping them fed and safe and schooled. As we, exhausted souls, navigate our way through a day without our own inner sunrise. How do we go within and hear the story of the sunrise from the sun itself when we are exhausted? We must do this work together because we are unable to bear the weight of reality alone. The modern world, after all, seems to be committing suicide. This stunning statement about modern life today was sent to me in an email message 2 weeks ago by John Cobb Jr., one of the major theologians of our era. His description of the world in these stark terms, he continued, has given him permission to feel hopeful because every aspect of modern life must now be thought about in new terms. These new terms begin as we learn how to bear the weight of this modern reality. James Baldwin, one of the master essayists, novelists, and public intellectuals of the 20th century, explained what he meant by the words, bear the weight of reality, during his 1986 National Press Club presentation. We are living in a world in which everybody and everything is interdependent, Baldwin said. And he continued, it is not a white world. It is not a black world either. And the future of this world depends upon to what extent and by what means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which cannot bear the weight of reality. We liberate ourselves from words that cannot bear the weight of reality through love. We do this work together in small groups as we shelter in place because we cannot bear this weight alone. We go within and hear the story of the sunrise from the sun itself when we are together. We journey inward as a poet, as an artist, as a pilgrim, and we stay the course with others who have also begun this journey by turning inward. Each of us slowly descends into our pain and suffering. We journey into our loss and loneliness and our utter exhaustion, and we keep going until we feel the presence of others. This feeling is grace. It's love. It's the full presence of others who care. Our soul feels this presence and shines forth like the rising sun. So if you know pain, loneliness, loss, fear, and dismay, but do not know the feeling of being sustained by a love that is wider, deeper, and infinitely vaster than these sorrows, join together with others and watch your solo journey turn into an inner sunrise. We can do this work together, 2 at a time, in personal relationships, 10 at a time, in love beyond belief groups, hundreds at a time, in our congregations, hundreds of thousands at a time, in our religious movement, millions at a time, as we take our commission deeper and deeper into humanity's heart as a justice-loving people who will transform the world. Every Sunday morning, we take one more step together and measure every season of our life in love.